For some toy collectors, it doesn't always have to be that vintage 10-back, mint on card, soft head variant, or the mail-away exclusive to get their toy spidey sense going. Action figures collected by adults aren't only the vintage ones. And toy companies have been creating toys specifically targeted at the kidult market. Finding the right balance between nostalgia and that modern toy detail and articulation that was never possible to find on the shelves when they were kids. In this week's Ed's Retro Geek Out, we're taking a look at adult action figure collectibles, so be sure to subscribe to the channel for weekly toy related videos, and let's drop in for some toy history. There's nothing driving us more to collect these pre-2000 toys than nostalgia and obviously the thrill of the hunt when finding a great deal. Having a toy on card or in box lets you relive that feeling of getting a case fresh from the toy store shelves. Where the toys lacked, your fantasy would fill in the remaining pieces of the puzzle to create the perfect storyline. But even as a kid, we've always wondered why certain toys didn't look like the movie. Why certain toys didn't have the right action features they were known for from the cartoon. Toys back then also didn't have the fully articulated features like more recent toys do. To be perfectly honest, back then they didn't really need to do much to turn that plastic into profit. And it still amazes me that some of these backstories still capture the imaginations 30 and 40 years after the original release. The toy companies simply cut corners on paint or details to make sure the toy was at the right price point, because the company's main mission statement is to make money. So creating an action figure that was an exact copy of their on-screen character was often not within the budget or within the need of the target group. In the late 90s, that all changed as some toy companies started popping up that would fulfill that wish and ultimately create the rising of the kidult market. The adult collector's share of the market is growing faster than the actual toy market right now. When toy store giants like Toys R Us closed down, toy sales saw a significant decline, and perhaps the rise in adult action figure collectibles and nostalgia sales will help retain the sales needed for the market. The kidults, as this part of the market is known for, spent £383 million on toys in 2017, and that's only in the UK, accounting for 11% of what is the total market share for toys. £1 out of every £9 spent on toys is adults buying toys for themselves. And every toy fair there seems to be more products for this target group and more companies popping up to get a piece of that market share. Whether it's re-releasing vintage toys, reimagining them to the smallest detail, simply making one mold that could fit all pop culture like Funko Pops, or the reimagining of an important pop culture movie to Playmobil, Legos, or other already known merchandising. Yeah, it's not just cars and trains anymore for these adult collectors. Now, the journey of how we got here is an interesting one. And for me, it all started in the marketing of the early years. We've basically been groomed to collect from a very early age on. The action figure as we know it was created in the 60s and targeted to boys. Barbie was already established, so you couldn't call them dolls. They needed to be action figures to appeal to the boys' imaginations, and tough strong men like the original G.I. Joe or later Big Jim fit the profile just right. Before the late 70s, toys had more of a one-to-one relation where very few were part of a bigger story or toy line. Then the 80s rolled around the corner and bam, every toy line would get their own Saturday morning cartoon to push the toys to kids. A cartoon often was just a content storytelling medium to sell the toys, a giant advertisement. Feeding the constant need for more, you had to collect them all. Later in the 90s, you had call to actions like, gotta catch them all. But even back then, some very talented people wrote some great stories and created some likable heroes and villains, which made the toys sell even more. And those stories didn't only retain the kids kids from buying the toys, they also retained them as a lifetime customer, as the adults still buy these same characters. It's really no wonder so many of us have a shelf or a room dedicated to the toys and other pop culture stuff we grew up with, showcasing all the things that made you happy as a kid. You would go hunt for nostalgia at flea markets, garage sales, toy conventions, and eBay to get that last missing piece for your collection. We've been indoctrinated to collect from the start, and many of us are still chasing to get a full set of Thundercats, Masters of the Universe toys, or Star Wars. And that brings me to the first part in this story, Reassured Nostalgia. Whenever something passes 20 years, it becomes a collectible. There will be people reminiscing about this. It's something weird in our minds that automatically happens. And Star Wars might actually be a good way to start. There isn't many toy lines as popular or prolific as a success story for Kenner. Millions of kids grew up with these toys, and almost 20 years later, after the first toy line, they launched the Power of the Force in 1995. Which were pretty much just updated versions of the toys that were still made a decade earlier. Created to coincide with the toys from the new trilogy, kids back then were still watching the original trilogy and getting the Power of the Force toys. But there were also grown-ups getting these and often buying the whole set. By then, Star Wars vintage collecting was already big, and this fed the collectors even more. They already had most of the vintage line, and these throwback toys were perfect to feed that collecting frenzy. Now, what do you usually do when you already have a full set of the vintage ones? You expand that collection with bootlegs, knockoffs, and newly released merchandise. The middleman was pretty much cut out, because before you needed to get mom or dad to buy you a toy, or you needed to save up enough allowance and still get permission from mom or dad. So the decision maker in the process was changed to the product user, and therefore they needed to create the toys with this in mind. What the Star Wars Power of the Force did great was create toys that tied in nicely to the nostalgia of the original trilogy that so many kids did grow up with, even though at first they did this with a twist, as they were bulkier toys that looked kind of like all the other ones coming out at the time. For boys, you know, the bodybuilder Chewie and Han Solo, but this quickly changed to a more screen-accurate toy. These toys were basically just a little 90s upgrade quality-wise, and perhaps with a better sculpt and a little more variety in paints. But there was still more to achieve to immerse the buyer into the toy experience, reliving the whole moment of buying that Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader for the first time again. And again, and again. Now, nostalgia is one thing, because now we're pretty much used to have remastered movies and games. You will also get re-releases of action figures classic molds every couple years, because people will keep on buying them. The re-releases like Transformers, TMNT, when Nickelodeon got the license, and they didn't stop there. There's a ton of released merchandise where you can clearly see which ones are intended for the kidults and which ones are for the kids. And even the real Ghostbusters got a re-release by Hasbro. Super7 made a whole series of Master of the Universe toys where they would change the appearance ever so slightly to really tie in to the cartoon. But they could also just combine two major franchises and have the WWE meet Masters of the Universe. Super7 started out as a mail-away magazine actually in 2001, and in 2004 they started their own toy store. And they're not the only ones creating 5.5 action figures. They're also released by Funko for many franchises like the new Thundercats ones. And of course Super7 has the whole reaction figures to celebrate the iconic quarter-inch action figure of her childhood. The iconic size and sculpting style was simple while allowing our imagination to go all in on our daily adventures. With reaction figures, we continue the classic size while making the figures we wish we had while growing up, and they'll easily fit in with all your other Kenner figures. These toys looked amazing, but still had some articulation restrictions. Apart from the reissues and the vintage collectors, there's also a whole market for the collector's edition toys. And for a lot of collectors out there, these are just as big of an investment as the vintage holy grails they're still chasing now. So nostalgia is one thing, but what if we had toys that were perfect representations of the source material? And they came with extra faces, extra limbs, a ton of accessories, and more points of articulation. Enter the fully articulated toys. And the journey to getting fully articulated toys started in 1994 with Todd Mcfarlane, who had created a character called Spawn. It was based on a comic book he had already created, where a superhero surfed the devil. A lot of investors actually jumped onto these comic books, buying multiple copies, with the golden age and the silver age of comics being great investments. However, the Spawn books, well, they were mass created, so that was kind of a wrong investment, even though quality-wise Todd Mcfarlane kept Spawn at the high end. And the toys for this comic book needed to be up to date to meet the high standards Mcfarlane had for his IP. He couldn't just license Spawn to just any company because they didn't fit his needs or what he wanted from a toy. He was in talks with Mattel, but reclaimed his license. They simply couldn't meet his high demands when it came to toys. If you're turning down Mattel, what else can you really do but make your own toy company? So he ended up creating Mcfarlane Toys, not only creating toys for Spawn, but also horror movie icons, video game characters, and even The Simpsons. They made the perfect collector's items with beautiful packaging, loads of detailed accessories, but also highly detailed sculpts and paintwork. These were functional toy collector's pieces, but all those extras came with an extra cost, and the price tag for these toys was significantly higher than other toys that were around at the time. Other companies would take this even further and create statues that were perfect representations of the movie or pop culture characters. These were companies like Sideshow Collectibles, who had previously provided prototypes for Mattel, Galoob since 1994, now also started aiming to create gorgeous collectible toys in 1999. Sideshow also had their toys available in Toys R Us and our big toy stores, while for some other companies you needed to really go to a toy specialty business, a comic book shop, or a geek shop that had a big variety. In 2000, Hot Toys came onto the market out of Hong Kong, creating the best toy statues based on movies. Mezco Toys rose up from the ashes of Aztec Toys in the same year, and together with Neca, they're some of the most well-known toy manufacturers for the kidult market. Neca, or the National Entertainment Collectibles Association, was founded in 1996, focusing mainly on film, music, and TV licenses, and then in 2002, Neca Real Toys was formed as a division to produce action figures and dolls. They are intended for teens and adults as collectibles for many licenses that no other company would market as a toy. Where other companies would go for really expensive toys, Neca would bring the same thing but at a more affordable price. And they were kind of in the same way as the Star Wars Black Series or the Marvel Legends we know now. But it wasn't just new toy companies jumping into the higher end toy market. Just take a look at the Hasbro Transformers masterpieces or the Haslab crowdfunded exclusives that really made you break the bank. Other toy companies even have payment plans for some of these toys, and there's always the frustration when you hear some cool toy is coming out, very exclusive to Target, exclusive to a Comic-Con, and you're wondering, how am I ever gonna get this without scalpers coming in between? And then there's Mattel's Matty Collector, who has put out almost every character in the Master of the Universe toy line without any commercials or cartoons to promote them. The Master of the Universe community kept this Master of the Universe Classics toy line alive, first by buying them pre-ordered only, and now even a $600 Snake Mountain is set for release 10 years after the first classic toy came out. They released every action figure from the toy line, cartoon, comics, movie, and beyond. It's truly a toy line made by fans for the fans, and sculpted by the Four Horsemen. Yes, these toys needed to be made by the best sculptors out there, and this sculptor's delight was brought to you by the Four Horsemen of Four Horsemen Studios. The four partners met while employed as figure sculptors at Mcfarlane Toys, and in September 1990, the four left Mcfarlane to found the Four Horsemen Studios, where in a partnership with Mattel they created hundreds of figures for Mattel's Master of the Universe, The Dark Knight, Harry Potter, DC Universe Classics, and Man of Steel toy lines, among others. Four Horsemen Studios is a collectible figure design studio and manufacturer, specializing in creating sculptures of toys and action figures. Sideshow also has a very modern approach to creating sculpts. A collectible at Sideshow Hasbro starts out with conceptual art, which may be several layers deep, then sculpting begins, primarily with traditional clay or wax sculpture tools. Digital rendering programs are also used, which are printed out in a rapid prototyping machine. The output is taken into a sculpture pool and then cleaned up to bring in an additional layer of detail by human hand. Craftsmanship all around. And there's a ton of smaller companies creating these art or designer toys. Customizers are even doing small runs of their perfectly imagined toy or altered original and popping them on Etsy or through one of the other many internet possibilities of providing guys with toys. There's simply no niche too small, or there will be one enthusiast creating toys specifically for that small target group. So we've covered the supply side of things. Nostalgic toys, high-end toys, and niche designer toys for any toy enthusiast. There's something to cling to, but there's also a change in how toy collectors are perceived now by the mainstream. Because in the last couple of years, the mainstream and the geek culture has kind of collided. You could say it's gone through a transformation. All of a sudden, geek culture became mainstream culture. It isn't that weird anymore to own toys as an adult. In fact, it might even be considered cool, hip, or whatever the kids are calling it these days. In the 2000s, we shifted to accepting geek culture. In 2005's The 40-Year-Old Virgin movie, you had that stereotypical collector with a massive toy and game collection having to sell that collection to show he's grown up now and win the girl. And back then, it did feel a bit odd that he had all these games and toys, yet nowadays we tune in to the Big Bang Theory every night, where the geek or nerd walks away with the pretty girl in the end. They buy comics, talk science, and go to Comic-Cons in full cosplay. We watch Game of Thrones, which might as well be a very detailed Dungeons and Dragons game, The Walking Dead, and tons of superhero series with their own Funko Pops. Even Hollywood doesn't seem to look any further than an 80s toy chest or some vintage comic books to create the next big summer blockbuster with its own movie toy line for kids and collectibles for the adults. There's no denying the Hasbro Transformer movies did really well. G.I. Joe and TMNT did a bit lesser, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe took over the torch from Christopher Nolan's Batman and created the superhero movie as we know it now. They're bringing back the movies from the 80s and 90s in reboots to create that nostalgia feeling, and it keeps on working. So I guess adult collecting is at an all-time high. We're just eagerly awaiting to see how far they can go with this and how they can get pretty much anything out of these franchises that they can turn into toys that people will still buy. It's been a wild ride, but I'm glad knowing that I can pretty much find a reissued, reimagined, or a piece of art toy from anything I grew up with back in the day. So I guess now it's time for me to go and pre-order that Neca Come Out Their Shells TMNT special edition box of action figures. Maybe I'll buy 2, maybe I'll buy 3, because am I gonna keep them mint in box? Am I gonna display them? So many questions, so many possibilities. Why do I even have nostalgia for the Come Out Their Shells tour? Wasn't that like horribly bad, that show? I guess I'll just buy it, and if you don't want to miss out on next week's toy history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you want to support the channel, then leave a like, leave a comment, and maybe share this video to a friend. If you want to do more, you can always join my Patreon or buy a t-shirt in the merch banner down below. Be sure to share your thoughts in the comment section down below, and if you have new topics for another toy history, you can also leave them down there. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week. Bye!